Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe for the month of June. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. My guest today is a first timer here on the channel. He is a historian working for the federal government and an expert in the history of military medicine and has published on joint medical policy, force health protection and readiness, epidemiology, mental health, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicide. He maintains historical interests, and in addition to publishing works on the U.S. in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, he has also served as the creative director to one of the U.S. Army's first digitally interactive military histories. He has also written a military history interaction with video games and is currently completing a chapter on the militarization of the zombie. A helper and public intellectual at heart, in his spare time, he aids students in strengthening their cover letters and resumes. As I said in the beginning, making his first debut here on the channel. Let's give a huge round of applause to Dr. Michael Doidge. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the channel today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that emphatic bio. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Michael. You're welcome. So before we dive into your background in history, is there anything else you'd like to add about any other project you're working on or anything else?
No, we'll probably get into it a little bit, but the other chapter I'm going to be writing right now is on basically defining post-traumatic stress disorder, which I feel
Mm.
has been ill-defined by historians and social scientists and even practitioners, to include clinicians, for a while now. So I'm kind of using a historical approach to basically say, okay, here is what it is. And that chapter will be coming out with, I believe, University of Kentucky Press. I believe it hasn't been finalized yet, but we're working it.
Nice. So let's just dive right in. So, Michael, for you, when did the history bug emerge for you? What was your aha moment that this was something not only that you wanted to pursue as an interest, but also saw as a prospective career choice?
Yeah, so I was actually extremely little. I was started reading military history very young, and by the time I was 12 years old, I was actually reading Clausewitz and the Makers of Modern Strategy, so basically the history of military theory. And I've found over time that probably what influences me most or interests me most are the history of ideas and how they connect with
Mm,
one another. I really like it when I kind of make sense of how the policy hits the pavement. Basically, what happens when you have an idea, you have an approach, you have an organization that's saying, okay, this is how we're going to do something, and then you have to try and execute it. So that's basically been the driving force of my history career. So I kind of knew when I was 12, okay, this is what I'm going to do. There's this point, at least I had to do it in eighth grade, where you had to write a letter to your future self, and then it would be mailed to your future self.
mm.
My English teacher did do this, and so I think she mailed it to me when I was 24 or 25. And so when I received it, the letter said, "Hey, Michael, are you getting your PhD in history?" And so I was from my eighth grade self, and I had just begun my PhD. So there we go.
Wow. And so during your academic schooling, how did the interest come about? Because you are in like a whole bunch of other, there's been like history of medicine, elements of the military, as you mentioned, post-traumatic stress and more. So how did those interests come about in your academic career?
So when you go to graduate school and you get a PhD in history, especially in the United States, you have to kind of define a major area of interest. And so that'll
Hmm.
oftentimes be something like, Americas, Europe, Africa. It's oftentimes continental. There'll be a time period, something like that. So I knew I would be an American historian and whatnot. I went to a school, there are not too many of them that emphasize PhDs in military history. Now you're getting into a technical specialty. It's one of the things that separates military history, in both a good and bad way, from other, historians, right? Is that a social historian doesn't necessarily need technical know-how to do what they do. This isn't to say that they're not important or that they don't do something important. It's that a military historian, though, needs to know how to read a battlefield map,
Hmm.
to know that a lieutenant leads a platoon versus a captain commands a company, right? Captain does not lead a platoon, right? That kind of logic. So there's a technical specialty in it. And then that technical specialty really spoke to me. It was something that I could do, something I was very proficient at. So then beyond all that, when I came to medicine, I was like, oh, this is just another technical specialty. And so that's why there's so few of us in the history of military medicine, because it's basically
Right.
technical specialties. It's to understand, how does the military interact with the society from which it formed, and how does the military interact with the world? And then on top of it, how does the military's medical system interact uh,
Mm.
with just medicine, because it interacts in different ways than civilian systems. You need to know how all that stuff kind of ties together and how it talks to each other. And it's just a bunch of learning of technical specialties, science, education, programs, processes, procedures, visions, missions, all those kinds of things that come together to form the basis of my knowledge. And I had a passion for it because it was basically what other people didn't do. I never wanted to
Mm.
be the person who insulted the craft. And to me, the insult to the craft is basically the equivalent of saying, like, well, did you read about the time that that service member climbed up a tree and saved a cat? Right? My point to that is to say, okay, but so what? Right? I didn't want to be the guy who wrote, about the histories of how 12, Americans armed with machine guns saved the world from itself. I wanted to basically make arguments that influenced things, that made sense for the public, that even if I could influence policy, inform better decision making, that kind of stuff.
Ah, okay. And then when you decided to go down the path of becoming a historian, in like the state sector, we'll probably go a little bit more in detail about that on the business side of being an historian. What were your goals that you set out? And I ask this question because for all historians, we all have our own reasons of like why we want to be historians. Like we want to either advance in a field of history, or we want to aid in the scholarship in a discipline that doesn't get enough recognition. So, what was your push on Michael? And from that, what was the initial reaction from friends and family?
Hmm. Well, I'll start with actually the latter part of that question because that's easy. I was blessed. My father and mother never once questioned what it was I wanted to do. They supported me wholly. So there was no, a BA in history. What are you going to do with that? An MA in history. What are you going to do with that? A PhD in history. What are you going to do with that? And, like, it was never any of that. Never. So I was blessed in that respect, and I'm grateful to them eternally for that, because they gave me one of the greatest gifts that parents can ever give to a child, and that is they believed in me. Um, with the latter part, with the former part now. Uh, so a lot of historians, right? We go, we get our PhDs in history, or whatever our degree is, our MA or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. But once we get to the PhD level, right? The presumption oftentimes, for the longest time, was, okay, you have a PhD in history, you have a dissertation, you're just like every other PhD with a dissertation. Now you will go and you will publish that dissertation and you will teach, right? And you will work at a university or college level. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that, I'm sure, as your guests have been frequently telling you, is that that's a harder path to traverse nowadays, probably than ever
Yes.
before in this nation's history. I was unique in that I never wanted to pursue that path. It's not that I didn't like the idea of teaching. I actually think I'm a pretty effective teacher. It's that, again, I was thinking in terms of, well, how does history inform decision making? And that
Right.
partly comes with the military history, although in truth, a social historian can do the same thing. A social historian, a cultural historian, economic historian, any type of historian can absolutely say, wait, we've done this before, and here's how we can, better inform decision making now.
Right.
For the federal government, the U.S. federal government, they love military historians. I mean, they also love other historians, but they love military historians because, one, there's a regulatory requirement oftentimes that we exist, and then two, we help inform military decision making in a variety of ways. Some of us directly teach military officers. Some of us help them by chronicling their history and writing publications that they then read so that they can better be informed about national security affairs. So,
Mm.
it was a natural thing for me to want to go into and to kind of pursue a career in. So I never looked at it as kind of a second place thing, even though I know for the longest time that's one of the things that it was pitched as, is, oh, sorry, you couldn't make it as an academic at a college or university, so here's government for you. No, many military historians I know are like, no, this is what we want to do because we want to
Mm,
either help national security or we just like working with military officers. We like military history. It's a safe space for us. And then the other reasons come into play too is that a lot of people have to think about with their career. It's not just historians. Is well, what do the benefits look like?
yes.
What's the salary? What's time off look like? What's like what is all that? And so what can I say in the federal government? Compared to our private sector and university and college employees, we're paid very well. So that's one of the first reasons to go into it. Second reason, my benefits are great. I work for the federal government. I have a pension. I have a 401k, same as public sector employees do, but many of them don't get pensions. And I get great time off. And what's more too, I get to travel because it's part of my role and responsibilities. What I do in my career. Whereas many university professors, it's like, oh, you want to go to that conference? Well, that's out of your own pocketbook, and it can be the case. So it's a good habitat for people with my career goal. Yeah.
Yeah, you actually touched on something they're actually going to be talking about later, which is, what are like, the long-term goals for an historian and the paths we go through. And you actually touched on something that I find very interesting, which is, you know, for all of us in whatever our academic saying is, it's like, BA, MA, PhD, we want to get like the big jobs, like working like in the state as a state historian, working in like the Smithsonian as like a researcher or an archivist. Those are like the dream jobs I think all historians aspire, but it's not an impossible opportunity or path. But for an entry level, it's a little bit more difficult because there's no experience to that. And then, of course, the voice of imposter syndrome is in the back of our head saying that, you don't belong here, you have no experience, you're literally entering a field where people have 10, 20, maybe even 40 years of experience ahead of you who know the discipline more than you. What can you bring to the field? So, for you, Michael, in your own personal journey, have you ever had those moments of imposter syndrome? And if not, what has continued to discipline you to not only study history, but also write and teach history?
Um, I've had moments of anxiety, but I actually have not had imposter syndrome. I don't know why that's the case. I'll just chalk it up to parents who believed in me and gave me the confidence to basically say, no, 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 you have something to add. I had great advisors too in graduate school. I have had great advisors who's carried me through. People who've at all stages in my life have said to me, read this book. This will ground you in the field. This kind of thing. And I just believed in myself and my capacity to kind of make sense of something in a way that was different and unique and brought perspective to things. But I have heard of imposter syndrome. It's just weird because it is foreign to me, and I don't
Mm,
know where others get it. Um, but I will say this, and I do want to make this point because you're bringing up the whole, well, how do we break into the field or whatever. I'll say in this interview, and I'll say for you personally, Gabriel, that going forward, if you have people who reach out to you and say, man, um, I would love to work at the Smithsonian. How do I make that happen? Put them in touch with me because I actually am very well connected. So I know people who work at the Smithsonian. I know people who work at the art gallery. I know people who work big federal institutions, and it's not a matter of necessarily being well networked, although that helps. But what that can do for you is that can teach you how to apply to that position, and
hmm
that's what I'm very good at. I know how to speak the language. I've learned it because I've done it now for more than 10 years. So my historical expertise is my historical expertise. And I feel like I benefit in that, and I have contributions to make in that too. But one of the things that I think graduate school is very poor at, and could use a lot of help with, is master's advisors, PhD advisors sitting you down and saying to you, "Here's how you apply to something other than being a college professor, a university historian." And so, for those of your viewers and those who are your friends on any social media who are like, man, I wish I knew how to apply to USA jobs, send them to me. I will help them. Like that is something I genuinely enjoy doing, and I'm where I am because people took time out of their schedule, not because they were paid to do it, but because they were like, this guy's worth investing in, and they invested in me, and so I made it to where I am. And I would like to, help others do that too, to include things like editing cover letters, helping them, write resumes, to use the proper buzzwords, those kinds of things.
Definitely. And that actually segues perfectly into the business side of the interview because you touch on a lot of important things, especially with the graduate school. And I know this very personally. When I was in my last semester of my graduate school at San Francisco State, we actually were at a seminar, and it was actually my professor, or one of my professors, and a bunch of people who were historians, but they were in not college professors or academic roles, but they were applying their background as a historian in other avenues. And that in turn helped me understand, okay, how do I best approach my own interest with history? Because initially I wanted to go into the Smithsonian. I wanted to go to the East Coast because I was very, very fascinated with not just artifacts, but also teaching about the history behind these artifacts, why they're significant, why they're important. And I definitely feel, again, as you said, that's not really taught well in school. Like, okay, like how does one market themselves and brand themselves in the historian field? Because if you're not going into the education side, solely being a college professor, you're kind of more on the freelance side, really trying to like pick and choose, different skill sets to apply to your own self and then branch out. So for you, Michael, you already knew what you wanted to go in your life with the interests, with the disciplines that you've been very, very focused on. However, I'm curious, did you know any people that went the opposite end on the freelance side? And then going back to you, you don't have to go full into detail, but how did the process go of going into being like a state store and working for like the state? Because I would imagine there's specific requirements and qualifications that they're looking for specifically for military history.
Yeah, actually, this is one of the things that makes the federal government kind of intriguing, is that if you go apply for a job in the federal government that is not teaching military officers, that is just a basic, standard historian, but at any kind of role, like it can be a GS7, which is usually an entry level, often for bachelor students, a GS9, which is usually for master students, a GS11. That's where you start to get your PhDs. But all of them, okay, all of them, you apply for that GS7, the GS9, the GS11, right? Here I've stratified it for you, but every single one of them will still ask you the same question, which is, have you done 18 credit hours or more in history? They will not ask for the PhD. They won't ask for the master's. Now, that doesn't mean that the hiring official on the other side isn't thinking in those terms. And it doesn't mean that with the stratification I've given you, that that stratification doesn't matter, because obviously a GS9, for an MA student does matter. It wouldn't have come about otherwise. But technically, the way it's credentialed, a bachelor student could apply for a GS15 to be a director of a historical agency, because that bachelor student has the credit hours required. That's because the federal government doesn't really look at historians the same way it looks at, like, let's say, a dentist. It's going to hire a dentist. It's not going to say, something to the effect of like, have you ever been in a dentist chair for somewhere around 18 hours? Okay, well, then you probably know enough to be a dentist, right? Like, no, it's like, no, you must have a degree and you must prove it. Whereas with the federal government, it's a little bit different. It doesn't really have the same kind of credentialing, and that's probably one of the ways that is baffling to the rest of us. Um, the best thing I can tell any historian who wants to go any of those routes, to include your own, what you're talking about, which would be kind of curatorial,
Mm-hmm.
is that all roads do lead to Rome. You just have to basically sometimes, one, create your own road, and two, kind of think in terms of, well, how do I make that road for myself? Most agencies, be they state, be they county, be they at a town, be they at the federal government, they have a mission, they have a vision, they have, basically this way in which they see themselves and the contributions that they give to society.
Right.
My advice to anyone is speak to those visions, missions, and contributions. Connect yourself to what it is the agency you want to work for what it wants to do, how ultimately it sees itself and its relationship to society, and connect yourself in such a way that you show that you will personally and professionally benefit, and they will professionally benefit, and they will grow. And by doing that, you then make yourself not only the better candidate, but you speak, and this is the key, you speak in terms of skills. This is one of the most significant problems I think that historians have when they come out of school, no matter what level, right? Is they say, I'm a bachelor student and I love studying this. I'm a PhD student and my dissertation's on this. Your topic does not define you. It's about the skills and showing your
Right.
in such a way. You said it, and it's a great thing to say, Gabriel, because that's how we need to be thinking in this modern age. We have skills that we offer as historians that are unique to the craft. I know many a historian who work at places like the CIA, FBI, NSA, where they do employ historians. They absolutely do. They want historians, but they don't advertise for those positions. Often, what they do is those types of places will advertise for an analyst, where you'll be looking at things like, let's say, intelligence, the same stuff that we historians do, where you analyze a document, interpret it, and basically say, here's what it says. Right? You come up with a summary, an argument. You're saying this is what this intelligence is telling me maybe will happen. Right? After you do that for so many years, then oftentimes you move over to their historical branches because they want you to understand what that agency's function is. So
Hmm.
you see how the agency's function, again, carries into your application, which is you need to speak to the agency's function in order to get the analyst type job to then shift over and become, the historian, if that's ultimately your goal. But alternatively, you could be an analyst.
Nice. And that actually kind of leads into the next question, which I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on. So now, Michael, I'm sure in schooling, we were trained to write a certain way. We have write for a master's and PhD for the academic community. But I'm curious, transferring now into like the federal government or like state or any other of those agencies, public or private, the dialogue and the presentation of history is vastly different in terms of like the language. So for you, transitioning from an academic mindset to more of a public speaking mindset, did you find it difficult to really write for the audience that you were being told to write for? And if not, what have you learned from it? And have you taught what you've learned to other historians?
I have taught what I've learned from two other historians. I didn't find the transition to be too difficult, but I tend to think about my audience that I'm writing for in general. I never wanted to be one of those historians who used big words and talked over his audience because I always thought to myself, what's the point in writing something that only three people can read? Right? How
Right.
does that benefit the broader, world at large? So since I already kind of structured the idea of my PhD behind the grounds that like, well, I want to connect people with ideas and I want them to connect them to their past, my kind of mantra always has been I want to connect someone's impersonal past to their very personal present and future. That was like always my thinking.
Right.
Okay. So, like if whatever your love is of something, I mean, I'm esoteric, right? So your love could be something like, I don't know, like reading Lord of the Rings, right? Well, if your love is reading Lord of the Rings, then, I want you to know, okay, well, World War I, World War II, those influence those books. And you can't understand how those books, come about without those wars. And then on top
Yes.
of that, those books then are going to lead to, Gary Gygax and the writing of Dungeons and Dragons and the creation of the modern role playing system.
Hmm.
Now, even if I'm playing a role playing system that exists in a non fantasy realm, like let's say a science fiction realm, like I don't know, the world of Shadowrun or something like that, right? That's all tied together, right? So I can basically get you to the point where it's like, hey, you can't have Shadowrun without having, Gary Gygax, which means you can't have that without Lord of the Rings, which means you can't have that without, something like Nazis, right? What I've just laid out there is a very simple means of basically relaying understanding. And that's how I think. I want the understanding to be the key. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty details. And I don't want to, as a historian, be the kind of historian who says, well, let me focus on the minutia, the details that, are basically lost to time to the degree that only, three people have experienced it. I want to talk to the broader picture that everyone's experienced so that I can draw in connective tissue so that we can all make sense of a collective and shared past. Even though, as you've enunciated, right? My topics are very specific. I'm oftentimes talking about, things that are like epidemiology that people don't deal with in their day to day. But because we all do deal with disease in our day to day, regardless of whether we're sick or not, right? There is a connective tissue there that we can all connect to. So my federal writing has reflected that as well, and I think that that's a really good thing.
Awesome. And that actually perfectly segues into the next question, which is, you know, as like historians, as authors, we are always inspired by the books we read and how it impacts our own writing. Like myself, I'm heavily inspired by Bernard Cornwell, Valerio Manfredi, Alan Smale. All those authors have really helped motivate me to craft my own voice as an author, but also more so of like the books of the reference authors, which Wolfram for the Rome. Uh, there's quite a few that I remember from graduate school that I still have, but all those have helped me in terms of writing history that makes sense. So for you, Michael, who would you say during your academic and now, what authors or famous historians have like really helped you hone your writing and your historical voice to where, as you said, where it connects everything together, but people will not get lost in like the more technical terms where only, as you mentioned, three people are going to understand?
Right. Yeah, there's so many to list that you would just run this thing for 2 hours. So I won't. But I mean, one of the best that I've ever read, and he's not famous by any means, okay, but his name is Michael Doubler. He wrote a book called Closing with the Enemy, and it's a fantastic book because it's about basically how the Americans learned to outfight the Germans in World War II. Okay, any historian, you don't have to be a military historian, any historian reads that book and they're going to see clear, concise, specific language that's not technical jargon, that's not going to get them lost in the weeds of, wait, what in the world is he talking about? What military organization? What weapon system? All that jazz. He's talking in very, general terms. Like I remember like one sentence very specifically that basically talks about when the Americans had to go do battle in the Hurtgen Forest, and he basically says something like, to the effect of, Americans were unprepared for battle, in the Hurtgen Forest. Like that's like the topic sentence, and then he goes through the doctrine, which really didn't, help the army to make sense of, well, how do you do forest combat, whatnot, and he basically breaks it down so that it works like that. But beyond all that, I mean, I love Charles Royster, who wrote A Revolutionary People at War, may rest in peace. Charles Royster, basically wrote about the character of the U.S. American military in the Revolutionary period, and I loved that. But the other thing I advise, and the other thing that I love too, is I draw from literally literature. I mean, again, literature is grounded in ideas that are grounded in a time and place, so it was funny. I recently someone recommended to me like, oh, you should read The Fourth Wing, right? And I read The Fourth Wing, and
Oh my gosh, I
right,
know that book.
right. And she's talking, but what is she talking about? Really, truly, what is she talking about? Okay, she's talking about a war college. Okay, yes, it is absolutely Harry Potter meets like the Hunger Games meets all that, but what she's fundamentally talking about is a war college. Okay, the U.S. Army War College, the Navy War College, the Air War College, right? The my world, the world of how do we teach military officers how to fight in a professional setting. No, we do not make them ride dragons and kill each other. No, but there is some logic to how she came up with this, and of course, right, like it's grounded in a real-time setting. That logic, right, like that. Her husband went off to war. That author, like, it's not that she's divorced from the military or anything to that effect. She's a service member's wife. She's lived this. Whether her husband went to war college or not is kind of actually irrelevant. I'm assuming he probably did go to maybe the Command and General Staff College, and so she just imagined a world she wanted to do. But it is grounded in a place and a time, even to the degree that she writes about what the scribes do. And here's the scribes that are like, we are the scribes of this war college, right? And whatever it's called, Basgiath or whatever the war college's name are, right? And she's like, those scribes, what they do is they take intelligence reports and then they write up the history, and then that history informs our military thinking. That is actually what we do, right? Like that is literally what we do. And so I'm reading it and I am chuckling. I'm like, okay, this is cool, right? So I mean, this is the other thing that I would encourage historians to do. Absolutely read fiction. Read it because it's grounded in a world of its own creation, but it's also grounded in our world,
Yes.
and that's great. That's a great thing. Bottom line, anything you want in this world can be wisdom. You can go rock climbing and gain historical wisdom if you're being open to new experiences and ideas. It's just how we gather it. And I feel us historians, that's what makes our craft so rewarding, is that we get the joy of what a fiction author does, and that we get to ask a fundamental question and create a world out of it. It's just that it's more challenging in that we don't get to just invent things. We have to actually
Right.
abide by certain laws and rules, which are, what are the documents telling me?
And that's 100% true. And now hearing that, it actually makes me appreciate my book, Amnesty of Persia, which is it's a historical fiction story, but it's a what if story. If the Persians beat the Greeks during the Second Greco-Persian War, what would that world look like, and what would the ripple effects be? And now, finished with the second edition, I added a new thing, which is how it would play into later Rome. But in this world, they have their own military college, their own Greek Persian war college, which I then borrowed from Rome, and how historians, contemporary historians, and classical historians of the age describe, okay, what was the war colleges of Rome that would have taught soldiers how to be infantry, the tactics, how would they go about their daily drills? So I had to research all that. And you're right, it is very fascinating. As historians, we do want to create the world, like bring these stories to the forefront for people to read, but we are in a way constricted by either the sources, and also depending on the audience and the age group that we're writing for. But at the end, as you said, anyone can gain historical insight. You just have to be willing to be open to new ideas, which then leads into another discussion, which I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. Now, I usually have this question for authors, but I'm going to try to word it for this interview, which is, in my author interviews, there's a thing which is, do you know your readership? And I usually ask this in addition to the audience, because as historians, like authors, we have like a general audience that we want to try to connect with, while on the other side we may want to focus in on a very specific audience. And the readers is a little bit different from the audience. It could be someone that has never read anything like this before, or maybe an audience we did not expect. So for you, Michael, in your writings about, the US and Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, did you have a particular reader in mind when crafting stories for those topics? Or did you write it with the mindset of being very broad, but being surprised by how many people connected to this?
Yeah. So, I think one of the reasons that actually military historians even exist in the first place is that we kind of understand, at least on some level, that humans are tribal, right?
Yes.
So we kind of get this whole, like, we like our cliques, and some of the first experiences that any of us are going to remember with this is we get to high school and we have our clique, and we
Mm-hmm.
fit ourselves into a niche, and we sometimes say, well, I'm this because I'm not that, right? Like, I'm a nerd because I'm not a jock, something like that. And we say, this is my niche, this is my clique. It's funny because in high school, I was the guy who moved between cliques. It wasn't that I didn't have people that I loved and trusted, and I said, these are my guys. I did, but I wasn't someone who you could pigeonhole. And I find I'm that way in writing as well. Um, so when I write about military tactics or something to that effect, those chapters, those articles are very specifically geared towards, let's say a lieutenant. It's basically to say, look, here's what happened at the ground level to this platoon. Here's how it dealt with the situation. Now you read it, you make sense of it, and you can say to yourself, huh, would I have done the same thing? Something to that
Mm-hmm.
effect. But where possible, I always try to broaden the audience, because again, the more people you can inform, the more people that can learn, the more people that can benefit, the better it is. So when I wrote the most recent Vietnam works I did for the Department of Defense's Vietnam War commemoration before I left that agency, uh, that stuff I wrote with the idea of a middle schooler or high schooler reading it, and I wanted to place those posters into middle schools and high schools because I wanted them to understand you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And
Mm.
so you don't get to basically say, oh, counterinsurgency, that was something that happened in Vietnam and that'll never happen again. Because when I was writing those posters, we were still very much in Afghanistan. And here we
Yes.
are today staring down the barrel of two active wars that, though we're not directly involved in, could very well have second and third tier order effects that do lead to, American involvement. And that's the thing, is that when you get involved in war, you pay with blood, and that ultimately always has a ripple effect on society. So I want students to understand that, right? So that's a little bit beyond, what a lieutenant would care about. And I'm hoping that, students become maybe better civilians or better citizens because of it. And then finally, the other stuff is actually a little bit tied to, like, your authorship question, which is, well, Mike, why are you writing about the militarization of the zombie? One, because to a historian, pop culture must matter, because why else would it exist? Right?
Yes.
So pop culture matters to even military decision making. Even military decision making. Why? Because the exact same year that the U.S. Army came out with what is still a very jokey, but still, Con Plan 888, right? The con plan for how you're going to deal with zombie apocalypse. So did the CDC. Why? Because zombies were a perfect template to make sense of it. But at the same time, why else am I writing it? Because it's fun. Because it's legit fun to write on that. And I'll tell you what, my readership for that is going to be those 14-year-old boys who would love to know nothing more than what would happen if the American military, with its current might, met a zombie apocalypse, a bunch of shambling, walking towards them zombies. And I'm going to use all those great technical terms like wide area security, and zone defense, and just all that stuff, that kind of combined arms maneuver, military doctrine type stuff that they'll love, to say, here's how we as a military would blow the hell out of them, right? They're going to love that too, because it's fun, and so they should read it, right? And I mean, why else read if you're not engaged or enjoying or
That's
learning?
100% true. And honestly, everything you said in this section has been probably the most profound I've ever had from any guest, which now leads into probably the most important question, which I want to hear your thoughts. And we kind of teased on this in the beginning, which is the long term goals for an historian, which from the many people who I've interviewed thus far this year, two things emerge, which is, do you want to be this or do you want to be known as this? And initially, that was for an author. But now looking through the lens of an historian, it still applies the same way. Do you want to be an historian or do you want to be known as a historian? Because those have two very different goals with two very different paths. And I definitely think the biggest harm, which I think you may agree or disagree, for new and entry level historians who want to get into the big jobs like either working for the federal government, working for a state, working for an agency or organization, because they've been working on this thesis that they are really proud of for years and years. And I think I'm going to go into the job that I want. This is going to establish my legacy. But one person who was an author gave me a pearl of wisdom, which I've applied to the historian, which is, there is no guarantee for any first timer that their debut anything is going to be the start of their legacy. And now this was, of course, for an author, but it still applies to a historian, where opposite ends of the coin, you can have authors and historians whose first work or first publication grants them to either award-winning status or global recognition in their field, and that is great. But on the other side of the coin, you have those that rise, fall, rise again, and then completely fall, and then their passion is just dead. They're no longer interested in history. It's no longer fun. And then that voice of imposter syndrome comes back with a vengeance. So, Michael, in your words, from your experience working with others, how important is it for first time historians to really understand that their debut, anything, no matter what it is, a dissertation, thesis, work, publication, whatever, is not going to be the start of their legacy, but it should not deter them in the pursuit of history, be it public speaking, writing, teaching, or preserving?
Honestly, you've said it better than I'm going to be able to. Like you've absolutely got it. So yeah, I mean, if I'm talking to your audience right now, I'm telling them, and anyone who's listening to this, uh, when the time comes, the best master's thesis is a completed master's thesis. The best dissertation is a completed dissertation. Do not define yourself, by what you write. Understand what I said before. All roads lead to Rome. You can make that happen. When I finished my dissertation was on the U.S. Army from 46 to 64. I'm very proud of that document. I love that document, but it does not define me. And of all things, the thing that, and to be fair, I'm not famous, okay? And I don't think I'll ever be famous, even whatever. But within the history community, within the people who care, there is something that I'm known for, and that's that I helped produce a history of suicide. It's not a book, it's a journal article, because it needed to be. It was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a big deal because they don't typically publish historians. And what it was a historical examination of the U.S. Army, which is one of the first public health institutions, looking at its suicide rates from the 19th century to the present. It was a very longitudinal view of suicide. The reason it was important is, of course, because it hit on the now, right? And the now just happens to be that that's a topic that we care about. Had I published this in the 1980s, assuming I was this age, right? Like no one cares, right? Because it doesn't matter. So, I mean, you could take from what I've just said, what we need to do then is always have the sexy topic. No, don't always go for the sexy topic, because if you don't love it, you won't write it.
Right.
You need to go for the topic you love. Just don't get so obsessed with it that you think it's the only thing. Because if I lived or died by my dissertation, then I've died, right? It did get me someplace, and that's important. But what it did get me to was me creating the U.S. Army's first digitally interactive military history, or at least first to the best of my knowledge.
Right.
Right. And that's a great thing. That was awesome. And at the time, it mattered. It still matters in certain ways. I'm not trying to say, play it down. But that's the thing, is that the dissertation itself wasn't the thing. It was the thing that got me to the thing. That's the way to think about writing history and writing anything. Is it's the thing that gets you to the thing. It shouldn't be in and of itself what you focus on. And if at the end of the day you end up writing, a very specific history, like I don't know, army logistics in the 1950s, and then you say to yourself, okay, now I am the expert on army logistics in the 1950s, and you should consider yourself that, right? You wrote a dissertation on it. But if you hold out hope and say to yourself, now what I do is I wait for the army to hire, for the logistics historian job, that is one freaking job, right? You need to think broadly, right?
Right.
Especially in this day and age, because you are a historian and we are, maybe a dying craft is the wrong term, but we are definitely a shrinking craft, especially
Yes.
in terms of employment.
Mm-hmm.
We, need to basically talk in terms of flexible, usable, willing to do anything, right? So, the time came and I was at my first job and they said, we need someone to write a monograph on gender and war. And my team, was sitting around a table. I just raised my hand and said, I'll do it. Technically, I had no business doing that, but I also understood I will learn something new. I will make the best contribution that I can. I was proud of that contribution. No, it didn't make or break me. I think it helped me a little bit. But, like it was a new experience. It was a new education. And if you're good enough about this, what you'll find is that you quite literally are, the poem, I am large, I contain multitudes. And
Mm-hmm.
all knowledge can kind of reinforce future knowledge, and you can contextualize and make sense of things and pull from, various areas of interest and knowledge in ways that you just never thought possible before. And then you'll impress the hell out of some people. And that's what creates your shot.
Definitely, definitely. And also to add to that, as one author said, grit trumps talent. Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter if you are the best writer, doesn't matter if you can craft the best story or anything whatsoever. If you're not willing to go through the hurdles, the fires and the flames, little Dragon Force reference, because I know a lot of you enjoy that little reference. If you are not willing to accept the hurdles that come from any position, no matter what it is, may want to reevaluate what you want to do. But if you do accept the hurdles that come with the benefits, then grit transforms into talent. And that is probably one of the most important things. And we're now reaching almost the end of this incredible interview, Michael. So I'm going to combine these last two questions together. Now, you've already mentioned that your family have been like big supporters of you from the get go. But are there any other people you would like to name drop who have been big supporters of you from your academic days to even now?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the keys is my fiance, Jenny Bermudez. I mean, just absolutely love the hell out of her. She's in the other room right now. I don't know. She can probably even hear me. She's probably close to the door, being like, "Oh my God, he just mentioned me." Um, um, you know, uh, uh, got a list as well. My advisors. Persons like Dr. Michael Nyberg's at the Army War College, Dr. Heather Sturr, Southern Miss, Dr. Andrew Wiest, also at Southern Miss, Dr. Dale Smith, retired from the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences, Dr. Donald Hall, who works at DHA, I think, yeah, Defense Health Agency, um, and I mean just countless others. I mean, there's been no end to the support. I mean, just it's one of the things that I feel I really have appreciated about working in the field in discipline and military history too is we have, of course, the Society for Military History. It's an academic, market, whatever. And so when we gather and whatnot, even though oftentimes we're all competing for the same job, I don't get the sense of the nastiness.
Right.
I get a kind of sense of camaraderie and like, look, we're in this together, and we all contribute
Mm.
in our own little way, and that's also really nice and kind, and I appreciate that as well. So yeah, that's all been extremely useful and helpful as well.
Definitely. And it actually reminds me a lot of like the indie author community. Like I've been very fortunate to meet a lot of people in this community who have been very supportive, very helpful, and almost like what you said, we're all in this together. We don't want to be, we're not competing with each other because we're all in the same boat. We all want to get our stories out there. We're going to be there and support one another and provide insight, tips, and tricks that we've learned to help them and vice versa. And the next question, which is a reflection question, well, the first of two, which is for you, Michael, looking back at your life now, everything that you've gone through to get where you're at right now, have you ever thought to yourself in your own private moments how differently your life would be? Not essentially you didn't go the historian route, but you were not an historian working for the federal government. How different would your life be?
It would be insanely different. And for the worse, absolutely for the worse. I can't speak for other historians, but I know that I can't turn that switch off. I'm a historian at all times. I watch a movie and I'm thinking, what is this movie saying? I read a book. What is this book saying? I play a
Yes.
video game. What is this video game saying? Always, always context. And I love it. I love that. I love the way that it has made me think about the world and view the world.
Hmm.
Having said that, I mean, I've no doubt that other historians view the world differently, and they should, and that's great. That's part of what makes our whole community so valuable. Um, I think one of the best I ever heard was I was blessed to basically work with a psychiatrist who was also a bit of a historian himself. He'd done psychiatric history and whatnot, and we go out to dinner, and he sees one of his cousins, a young woman, and the stately psychiatrist is talking to the young woman, and the young woman just happens to offer up that at our shared dinner that she ate baby food until she was in her 20s. And I looked at him when she walked away, and I said, "Does that trigger anything up there? Do you like start diagnosing or anything like that?" And he just looked at me and flatly said, "Nope, off the clock." Freaking loved that line. But I would say, as a historian, I am never, ever, ever off the clock, and my world would be insanely different if I did not have the opportunities I've had to make the contributions I've had. So I am blessed. I'm hoping for another like major hit like I had with suicide, maybe on a less depressing topic. But even if I don't get it, I feel, because I'm about probably at this point mid career, that there's a lot still left to do, a lot left to contribute. And that when I have those moments of burnout, that is what kind of helps refuel the ambition, get me going again.
Nice. And now we arrive at the final question, which I think you've already answered, but I'm wondering if you can add anything more, which is with everything that you've learned, everything you said in this interview, what are your words of wisdom to other historians who are watching this video, who are reflecting on their own career path of what they want to do with their degree? What is your word to them?
So you had the you had the Great Dragon Force quote. I'm going to basically kind of paraphrase it with my own kind of quote, which was taught to me by one of my advisors, which is 90% of the master's or the PhD is effort, 10% of it is intellect. So
Mm,
you really put in the effort. And I this one comes from a television show, Rescue Me, um, which Dennis Leary, way back in the early 2000s, kind of post 9/11 show. And it's a quote that I live by, and it's basically, the harder I work, the luckier I damn well get. Um, and I fervently believe that. So I mean, that's what I'd offer. I mean, I get that I'm offering wisdom from taken from other sources, but that's the thing, right? Is what I said earlier.
right.
You can find wisdom wherever you look. One of my other pieces of favorite wisdom, to anyone who's slugging it out, is actually from, of all things, BoJack Horseman, a show on Netflix that ran a while back, not too long ago, and it's basically about mental health. And again, remember, I'm a historian of mental health, so to me that's important. And in the show, the quote goes, "It gets easier. It does get easier, but you got to do it every day, and that's the hard part." That to me is pretty much sums up the profession. You will find that it gets easier to write if you do it every day, but writing every day is the hard part. And
Hmm.
what I will tell anyone who tells me, that they're historian, and I'm going to show a little bit of my elitist side here, is when they say they're historian, I'll say, "What did you write?" It is very easy for any of us to sit here and just consume knowledge, but then to not give back. No, the historian's job is to argue and discuss with other historians, okay? It is to gauge in debate. And that's fundamentally what makes us of value. In all of my jobs, I have told my superiors, you will know if I did a good job if someone reads my work one day and then on top of it says, this guy is wrong. Because unless your name is Herodotus, we are all revisionists. We are all revising what has already been written. Journalists usually get to it first, right? We should not be thinking in terms of like, oh, I'm the first to touch any given topic. We may be the first to approach it a certain way, but the point is that we are there to offer up our wisdom, our collected analysis, reading, and all of that. And the best thing we can do is to absolutely write and get our ideas out there, and to publish. It's not or perish. It's just simply to do, because that's the craft. Um, but again, I'll admit that's a bit of the elitist side of me showing.
But that is perfectly said and a great ending to this amazing historians interview. Thank you all so very much for joining us today for the last episode for the month of June. I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Michael Doidge for coming on the channel. Michael, thank you so much. And what other projects are you working on that we can expect in the coming months?
Well, like I said, so there'll be the kind of chapter that defines what I think PTSD is. That's an important one, because just to use like the analogy to the flu, the way that we kind of understand PTSD today is oftentimes we understand it by its symptoms, right? And so we'll say, oh, PTSD, that's that 1,000-yard stare, it's the jitters, it's the triggers, it's all that jazz, right? Well, that'd be like saying, well, what is the flu, right? It's the cough, it's sometimes you sweat, it's headaches, it's nausea, it's no, those are the symptoms. What is the flu? It's a virus, right? So I'm going to actually say, well, what is PTSD? And I'm not going to define it by its symptoms. So it's not a symptomology to me, which is what I think we all too often do in society. So that's definitely an upcoming work. And it's, effectively its opening sentence is going to be something like, PTSD is like jazz. None of us can define it, but all of us know it when we encounter it. Um,
Nice.
the zombie militarization one is just fun. In the distance, I see myself doing a longer work on basically probably like something to do with global health and national security, because I don't really think that that's been touched upon too much. And it's way too easy for us to look in the mirror now and say to ourselves, well, COVID, right? That's a one-time blip. No, we live in the Anthropocene age. And so, as humans really encroach upon the animal kingdom and whatnot, and we interact with the world in ways that perhaps once upon a time we didn't, we're going to encourage a whole lot of medical issues to come about that maybe we hadn't before. And it doesn't matter, whatever other crises we're dealing with, something like climate change is going to encourage medical issues, second and third tier order of effects that I would like to delve into. Um, there's some other projects that I have ideas about, like in terms of, like, let's say central themes in American history that would be, I would love to lay out there and just kind of make it a very readable, kind of at that eighth, ninth grade reading level type book of just the conflicts between, for instance, longstanding conflicts between centralization and decentralization, the challenges we have as a country defining even the concept of liberty, things that both unite and divide us that we can make sense of, that are really, really, truly grounded in history. This isn't to
Hmm.
say that we don't live in unique times. We absolutely live in unique times, but we tend to miss the long view because our lives are so short. Because at the end of the day, even if we live for 90 years or something to that effect, right, like, that's only a fraction of the actual total history of still this young nation. And how much of that do we actually internalize and make sense of in adult sense? Your view of childhood is not the mature view of childhood. When I grew up in my decade, which was the 80s, right, I don't understand the 80s, not in the same way that an adult who lived through the 80s understood it. So the crises that bothered me were crises of, oh my God, when is the ice cream truck going to come around again? Crises of the 80s are not when the ice cream truck is going to come around again. And I may know them now, but I know them because I'm a historian in retrospect, not because I experienced them. So that's also a kind of work that I'd like to see, produced at some point or another. And then we'll just see from there. Thank you kindly for having me and for letting me ramble a little bit at you, Gabriel. Appreciate it.
No problem, Michael. No problem. And where can people find and engage with you if they want to reach out?
Oh God, I'm everywhere. I'm on LinkedIn. I've taken a little bit of a break from social media just because my own writing assignments have kind of pulled me away. But you found me on LinkedIn, or I found you. I can't remember, but we found each other, right? So LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on all social media and all that jazz. I haven't established my own website because, again, it'd be a little bit problematic
Right.
starting my career and what I do for a living. So probably those kinds of social media things. But honestly, like, I'll conclude with this one more time because it is a good point, right? Like, if they're looking at this interview and they're saying, "Man, this guy actually, I think, does what I'd want to do one day," or at least could maybe help me find the kind of resources that I'd like to find to be able to, find a job in the career, contact you and then contact me, because I really do appreciate helping. And I've had so many students recently. I mean, honest God, if it's at 30 to 50 at this point, I wouldn't be surprised. Contact me on LinkedIn and say, Dr. Doidge, how do you apply for a job, in the U.S. federal government on usajobs.gov and whatnot? And I have walked them through it. And a few have hit, and others that even have hit have just said, I have at least a much better chance now because I understand the language. So I genuinely think, we historians, it's one of the best ways we can help each other is apply our knowledge to how do you apply to things for each other. And I want to end the interview honestly with that. So find me, find you, and let's absolutely, help each other get to where we need to be, because in that way we kind of, help the entirety of the career, the entirety of the path float up.
Awesome. I will link that down below in the description of this video. Thank you all so very much for your love and support for the month of June. And be on the lookout for my July newsletter coming out soon, which will showcase July's lineup of authors, historians, and July's Historians Lounge guests. As always, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview and who was your favorite guest for the month of June. Until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill, signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.